Good evening, everybody. I have 8 o'clock on my clock, so we'll get started. Again, good evening and welcome to webinar number 4 in our series of 8 virtual sessions we'll be offering this year for U16 players, parents, and coaches. My name is Scott Stevens, and I'm the manager of programs and events for the Ontario Hockey Federation, and I'll be acting as the moderator for tonight's call. All 8 live virtual sessions will be recorded, so all parents, players, coaches will have the opportunity to go back and watch download the PowerPoint presentations. All presentations and slide decks are available on the OHF website under the heading Players, Program of Excellence, and then under 16 AAA Program of Excellence. We are strongly encouraging everybody to attend the live events to capitalize on interacting with our presenters through the Q&A sections at the end of each presentation. So you'll notice on the screen now, we have some meeting rules. I just ask that you take, if you can, yep, perfect, Anthony, thank you. If you can just take a quick look of the screen to review the rules for tonight's presentation. Like I mentioned before, there will be a Q&A opportunity at the conclusion of the presentation, but if you have a question during discussion on a topic, you can raise your hand or enter your question in the chat area and I'll get to you. If asking a question, I will enable your mic and address you by name before asking your question. When asking your question, please state your name, team name, and association. So for tonight's webinar, I want to introduce Anthony Wolf, who is a senior scientist with the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. Tonight, Anthony will be focusing on hydration for hockey players. On behalf of the group in attendance and the Ontario Hockey Federation, thank you, Anthony, for taking the time tonight and welcome. I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome, thanks, Scott. I appreciate the little intro. I'm gonna add to that real quickly, just because not many people are aware really of what the Gatorade Sports Science Institute is, or what we as GSSI and sports scientists actually do. So, real briefly, the mission of GSSI is to help athletes optimize their health and performance through research, innovation, education, and service in both hydration and nutrition science. So again, my presentation today is titled Hydration for Hockey Players, but we'll go a little bit into nutrition as well. And as GSSI scientists, we study the effects of nutrition on the human body before, during, and after exercise. We do this throughout all types of exercise. And if there's any professional league that you can think of, we've probably worked with those athletes. And we obviously do work with the World Juniors, if you ever watched any of those specials as well. So we'll dive into a little bit about how we help to work with those athletes and what we focus on with their hydration and nutrition as they prepare and perform. So I'll give kind of a real quick breakdown here of where we're headed. It's titled lecture, not really a lecture. We're not going back and forth or anything like that, so we get to the end. But essentially where we'll start out, we'll talk a little bit about the hockey athlete, maybe a little bit about the commonalities that we have with other athletes, the things maybe that set us a little bit apart. We'll dive into hydration, general hydration, why that's good for us, why we need it. And then we'll dive into some specifics that are directed right at us towards hockey players. Then we'll dive into basically the same things within what I'll title energy. And then at the end, we'll tie everything together. We'll put it together. We'll wrap it in a nice little bow and have a summary that we can kind of take home and hopefully remember and utilize as we progress through our hockey careers. So there are, like I said, there are commonalities in all athletes, and some of those are what we like to call kind of the 3 pillars to sports nutrition that lead us to our best performance. So the first one being that athletes use and need fuel for energy to train and compete at a high level of performance, right? We all need to be fueled and make sure that we have enough energy to perform at whatever our given activity is. The second pillar dives into hydration, specifically how athletes sweat and the need for hydration to replenish the fluid losses that come from sweat and help us to refrain from too high of increases in our core body temperature, thus decreasing our performance as we're exercising. And lastly, all athletes use and need muscles to help us be strong and excel at our particular sport. Every sport has some element of strength and power to it. And that's really kind of what our third pillar here is. Now, I'm going to dive a little bit into the research and things like that as to why hydration and again, energy are important for our performance. But I have to call out that most of the research in the sporting world has been done primarily in endurance sports. It's just easier to do that when you're riding on a bike and things like that. You can make measurements, they're easy. And more specifically, there has been less work done in hockey players. But we can take what has been done, and then we can also take the common themes between these pillars and fill in the gaps quite a bit, right? We can fill in and take the research that's been done and apply it to hockey as we see fit, right? So hockey kind of has that mixture of high and low intensity activity over a specific duration, lots of different changes in pace, right? We're a stop and go sport, backward, forward, all of our cuts, punch turns, all that kind of stuff. Has a ton of skill involved, right? Shooting, stick handling, passing, heck, even skating is a skill to those who may not be, the greatest. And then obviously hockey is an extremely physical sport, right? We, battling in the corners, all the grinding, open ice hits. And because we experience all these things at once, each of these pillars can actually take an even larger toll on our performance than if we were talking about just specifically an endurance exercise or anything like that. So like I said, there's kind of those three pillars. We're going to focus on two of them today, specifically hydration and energy. We'll make it so we can, have real good take-home energy to try to cram too much into one presentation at one time. So we'll start off with a little bit of hydration and we'll jump right in. So hydration is really a process that starts with fluid intake and ingestion, right? We have to get some fluid in, followed by the absorption of that fluid through our intestines and into our bloodstreams. And then eventually we get to the distribution of that fluid throughout the body. So that includes, not only the bloodstream, but into the cells like our muscles and things like that. And then finally, we either retain that fluid or we excrete that via some signals from the kidneys. So really there's kind of four main processes to our hydration. But that's really just to say that our hydration is always in a constant state of flux, meaning that it's always changing, right? And there's a lot of different factors that can influence that. Things like temperature, humidity, the environment, right? Whether it's hot, cold outside, training status, the intensity that we're playing or training at. And they all play a role in how well we maintain our body water or how fast we might dehydrate during exercise. Luckily for us as hockey players, right, a rink is a super stable environment, right? Temperature is always kind of mitigated. We got to keep the ice, hard and fast. The humidity doesn't change very much. And really the same can be said about all of our equipment, right? Only things we might swap out every now and then are those twigs when we break them, but the rest of it stays pretty stable. So we can actually eliminate most of those factors. Except for, mainly that intensity of exercise, maybe we're having a bad skate or a light day or something like that. And within those kind of factors influencing hydration, there are also kind of four main aspects that are going to affect how well our fluid actually hydrates us, right? So that's going to be the fluid intake. So you can think of how much fluid we're actually taking in. Again, that, fluid absorption, and that's going to be mainly driven by the energy content of our fluid, right? So whether or not the fluid has carbohydrate or sugar in it, or maybe it's just plain water. And then again, kind of that distribution and retention pieces where that's really going to be driven by the electrolytes that are in our beverages. And specifically, really, sodium is going to be the one that drives those two. Now, as most of us are probably already aware, water makes up the largest part of our bodies. Almost 60% of our body weight is actually just water, and 75% of our muscles, sorry. And water has a lot of important roles in our body, right? It does a lot of different things for us. But as athletes, generally speaking, the one we care about most is sweat. And the reason that we care about sweat the most is that it actually helps keep our bodies cool. So when we're playing, on the ice, even in the freezing cold rinks, maybe, in pond hockey, our bodies are producing just a ton of heat, right? When we get hot, it actually causes a lot of, very important functions that we need as athletes to kind of slow down and decrease, right? So our blood flow can kind of decrease, making our heart beat faster, making it feel like we're working harder than we actually are. But all that to say that dehydration can actually cause our performance on the ice to suffer. And that sweat, even though it's keeping us cool, can also be hurting us a little bit in the fact that it's kind of gonna bring down our top-notch performance because we're losing a little bit too much water. Now, like I said at the beginning, most of the science has been done in endurance sports, and kind of what that body of evidence has shown is that losing 2% or more of our own body weight due to fluid loss is enough to cause our performance to decrease. So, over the course of a hockey game or hockey practice, if we lose too much fluid, our performance is going to go down. And it's also been shown that dehydration can cause decreases in performance in high intensity exercise. So you can think, the real short bursts that we need, shift in and shift out. It can decrease muscle strength and power, grinding in the corner, and it can even decrease our decision-making capabilities when we're dehydrated. So, we all know how important hockey IQ is and how players can make a career off of just that. So, our sport combines all of those things. So, dehydration can certainly cause our performance to decrease too. And luckily, like I was saying, there is a little bit of science that can help us out here, things that have been done specifically in hockey. So what these researchers did is they actually utilized a scrimmage game with simulated overtime drills and high intensity practices after the scrimmage, right? So you can think of that as maybe some shuttle drills to check out how fast we're skating in an overtime scenario, or some shootouts with goalies to decision making and reaction time, things like that. And during that study, what these researchers were able to find is that those players who don't drink enough fluid and lost 2% or more of their body mass and sweat said that the game felt harder in the third period. The athletes said that they felt lightheaded, maybe they're a little bit more winded and a little bit more overheated than when they were fully hydrated. They saw a decrease in reaction time, so responding to pucks and things like that. And then in our forwards and defensemen specifically, they actually saw a decrease in number of targets hit in a shooting drill. And this is actually a pretty big one because that number was decreased in almost half, right? So if we think about the classic all-star drill, right, the 5 targets, players went from hitting on average 4.6 targets down to 2.6 targets when they were dehydrated. So that's a pretty big difference when we're talking about a decrease in performance. And, I mentioned reaction time, and sometimes that can be a little bit hard to put into context. What does that look like? So if we watch the 2 skates move across the ice, we can kind of see what that looks like in real time. Now, that doesn't really look like a lot. And to be fair, it's certainly less than a second. But we know that less than a second can be the difference between tipping the puck out of the blue line and going on a breakaway, or, if I'm a goalie sliding across the crease and getting my glove on it, to stop the last second goal. So every little bit helps. And if we can keep that performance high just by, having a little bit of fluid during our games and practices, that's probably pretty important. So if dehydration is bad and can hinder our performance, what is it that we as athletes can do about it? And, I've mentioned that 2% of our body weight lost in fluid a couple of times now. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to figure out, well, what's 2% of our body weight? And that means we need to weigh ourselves. So the first thing we do, we hop on a scale, then we grab our phones and we do a little bit of math, right? So let's say we hop on the scale, we weigh 75 kilos or about 165 pounds. Pop in the calculator, beep, boop, beep, right? 2% of 75 kilos ends out to be about 1.5 kilograms or about 3.3 pounds. Right. So what that means is that in terms of fluid, we need to try not to lose about 1.5 liters of fluid during our game. And the way we can do that is just by what we just said. We'll just weigh ourselves before practice, we weigh ourselves after practice, try to make sure we haven't lost more than 1.5 or 3.3 pounds. But in terms of fluid, exactly how much fluid is that? Well, 1.5 liters is 1.5 of our large green squeeze bottles that everybody's got, whether it says Gatorade or whether it says BioSteel on it, those are about the same size, right? So we need to try to mitigate a loss of about 1.5 of those. Now, how much we need to drink to make sure that we don't lose that much fluid is a very personal thing, and it will depend on our own personal sweat rate, which we'll get into in a little bit. But in general, a 165 pound athlete or a 75 kilo athlete, we want to try to stay below that 1.5 liters or 1 kilos loss of fluid. So, at this point, I've thrown a lot at you. You're probably thinking, okay, how do I avoid losing, 3.3 pounds of fluid? You said a sweat rate. What's a sweat rate? Well, essentially a sweat rate is how much an athlete sweats during an hour-long practice or game. So like I said, when we sweat, we're losing all this fluid. And the rate at which we're losing that fluid is a very personal thing. It can change on a lot of different factors that, some of the ones that we've already talked about. But essentially, once we know that, we can figure out how much fluid we do or don't need. And this is another spot, again, that we can lean on science, and we can say, okay, well, if I don't have the ability to maybe weigh myself before and after practice, what is it that, how much sweat do athletes, our hockey players on average lose? And generally speaking, it's a pretty large range. So if we can try to figure out what ours is, we probably want to. But generally speaking, hockey players can lose anywhere from just over 0.5 liter of fluid per hour, all the way up to 3.5 liters of fluid per hour, right? And that's really hard to put into context, but that's 3.5 of the squeeze bottles worth of fluid that we can lose in just a single hour of practice or a game. Now, at this point, I want to stop a little bit and I want to point out here that, having a high or a low sweat rate is not a good or a bad thing, right? Your sweat rate is what it is. It can change over time. It can change as we age. It can change as we grow bigger, as we, maybe as we lose weight. It's not good or bad. It's nothing that we can control. It's just something that we like to understand to figure out how much sweat we lose and how much to drink during our games and practice, so we don't see that decline in performance, and we make sure we're performing, at our top-notch level. Now, like I said at the beginning, I'm a scientist. It means that I have to throw at least one graph at you, right? We have to do like some kind of science thing here. So I'll throw this one out here. And now on this one, I don't want to focus so much on the numbers. I've already thrown a lot at you there. But rather, we want to focus on what this graph is telling us between the two different color bars in each position, right? So we've got goalies, defensemen, and forwards. And essentially what this is saying is NHL players tend to have a higher sweat rate, so they tend to lose more fluid than junior players. And essentially what that's telling us is that as we progress through our careers, as we get bigger, as we get faster, as we get stronger, we also sweat more, right? Games are more intense, we're bigger, so we need more fluid, and our hydration can play even that much, our hydration and nutrition can play even that much bigger of a role into making sure that we're performing the best we can when we're on and off the ice. So up to this point, we've mostly been talking about sweat as just water, but sweat is a little bit more than that. Our body fluids aren't just water, they also contain electrolytes. And the major ones are sodium and chloride, which is better known just as salt, right? We find that on our table, we put it on our food, makes everything taste great. At least to me, chocolate and salt are the two best things on the planet. So our body fluid is actually more like fancy salt water, right? And that fancy salt water can contain up to 9 grams of salt for every liter of fluid, right? So that's pretty salty when you think about it. And actually that research that we were talking about kind of on that last slide there has shown that the junior players can lose up to, and even some of them beyond, 5 grams of sodium in a single practice. So 5 grams of sodium in just 1 hour, right? And if we look at the, slice of photo there on the right, we can kind of see what that looks like there with that sweat stained shirt. That white section there might be a little yellow in the photo, but that white section there is actually all the salt that's lost in that athlete's sweat, right? So, us as athletes, when we're, taking off the, maybe our Under Armours or stuff like that, it's drying out. We have, stuff on the gitch or the loop or whatever we call it. But when it dries and you see those white stains, that actually is pretty indicative that we're losing quite a bit of salt in our sweat. I always like to use, when I'm speaking with the hockey guys, I like to use Crosby's old hat as an example, right? He always wore that same hat for all of his interviews and had that nasty little white stain on the brim because he wore it so often. And that's just all the sodium that he's been losing in his sweat. Now, the reason to kind of discuss, the fancy salt water that is our sweat and the sodium that goes all the way back, it actually goes all the way back to that kind of foresight that we saw, right? So we think way back, we had those 4 phases. And sodium is really important for fluid distribution and retention within our body. When plain water is consumed, fluid with, that's fluid with no sodium or electrolytes, and it really kind of dilutes the blood sodium concentration, which turns off the signal to our kidneys to reabsorb water, which actually causes increases in urine volume. But by contrast, when a sodium-containing beverage is consumed, so you can think of that as like a Gatorade or any kind of sports drink that has sodium in it, it actually can increase our blood sodium concentration, which then in turn stimulates the reabsorption of water into the kidneys for better maintenance of plasma volume, which is the water portion of our blood, makes it flow through our veins. And that, in fact, fluid retention increases decreases the urine volume, right? So if we're able to kind of retain that, we aren't going to go ahead and output that. And then we don't have to pee, which everybody knows, huge annoyance that you got to, we got all of our equipment on and then all of a sudden you got to pee, you got to take it all off and it just gets terrible. So when we're dehydrated or becoming dehydrated, adding a little bit of sodium to our fluid can help maintain, our blood sodium concentration, plasma volume, and then reduce how much we need to urine. And in fact, you can kind of think of fluid retention being almost directly proportional to the concentration of sodium that's in our beverage, up to an extent, right? We don't want to be drinking like seawater, which is absolutely disgusting, but a little bit always goes a long way. But it's not just the composition of the fluid that we're concerned about if we become dehydrated, right? So if we do become dehydrated, the volume is important, and most experts recommend that to achieve rapid and kind of complete hydration after exercise, right? That's the key there. This is after exercise, not during exercise, that we as athletes should consume a sodium-containing beverage in a volume that's equivalent to about 150% of whatever fluid we lost, right? So let's think back to our scale example again. If we lose, maybe 1 kilo of weight during that practice, to rehydrate, we would want to drink 150% of what we lost. So that would be about 1.5 liters of fluid, right? And that extra 50% of fluid volume actually helps to compensate for any urine that we're excreting during rehydration. But again, if we add a little bit of sodium to those beverages, it can also help mitigate the urine that we're losing and help complete that rehydration process. So, in summary of our hydration, we learned that during exercise, dehydration can decrease performance. Particularly, we saw that it can happen even in hockey players, that we want to try to avoid losing 2% or more of our body mass and fluid. And then we also learned that sweat rates vary between athletes. So you might not lose as much sweat as the guy next to you or the guy next to him. And it's important to be able to kind of figure out how much sweat we're losing ourselves when the opportunity presents itself. So now that we're finished with hydration, we'll take a quick jaunt. We'll talk a little bit about energy and what that means for us as hockey players. And when I talk about energy, what I mean is carbohydrates, or commonly referred to as carbs. And that's really what we use, or what our bodies use as energy. So What are carbs? Well, carbs are things like fruits, veggies, pastas, breads, pretty much anything that's got sugar and or starch in it. You can consider that a carb. And overall, in most activities, most exercises, most of the time, pretty much all the time, carbohydrates will be the predominant energy source to fuel muscle contraction. And that specifically holds true for hockey as well. Now, like hydration, a large body of science on carbohydrate intake has been developed around endurance exercise, right? So things like, riding a bike, like I said, or running marathons. And what that original research has shown is that having carbohydrates during exercise can reduce how hard the exercise feels. It can increase how long we can actually exercise for. It slows down the start of when we start to feel tired during that exercise. And then it can help prevent low blood sugar. And each of these things can help to improve or maintain our performance over kind of a longer duration. But because hockey is such a fast moving and complicated game, right? We talked about that. Measuring those things is super hard. But thankfully, there has been some research done again, and we can lean on that science and see what that means for us as hockey players. And what that science has shown is that when compared to the players that didn't have any carbohydrates during the game, those players that did, so those are the ones that did have carbohydrates during the game, they completed more tape to tape passes. They turned the puck over a lot less. They felt less tired as the game progressed through the second and third periods. And again, using those kind of shuttle drills, acting like overtime, those players actually skated 2% faster compared to the players that didn't have any carbohydrates, right? So that could be potentially awesome when we're, reaching those overtime scenarios. And I know I've mostly been focusing on skaters and players, but this stuff is just as important for goalies too. I didn't forget about you. I know I'm sure there's some of us listening, and there's some research here too. So in that same scrimmage type setting, right, the goalies that ate the carbs actually had a better save percentage in the third period. They felt, again, decreased fatigue, not only just in the third period, but also in the shootout drills that follow. They had a decreased heart rate during the entirety of the game. So that could mean that, their bodies aren't working quite as hard to pump the blood to the places that it needs to be. And they actually had a faster reaction time. So in this specific study, that meant that when, these goalies were facing 2-on-1s, they actually responded to that 2-on-1 faster than, the counterparts that didn't have the carbohydrates. So again, we can see, even when we're talking about goalies, making sure that we have enough energy when we're playing, crucial for our performance. So if eating or drinking carbs during a game is beneficial, how much should we have? Right? Now, before and after, if we have a good diet, are likely going to be covered by our pregame meal and then, our big dinner afterwards. So what I'm going to focus on here is kind of just that middle part here, the during exercise carbohydrate amount. And what we've been talking about leading up to this is kind of, that sustained performance has been all about carbohydrates during, practices and games anyway. So we'll stick there. Now, generally, having up to about 30 grams of carbs per hour is enough to keep us performing at our best, particularly when that exercise is less than 60 minutes in duration. But what does 30 grams per hour mean? What exactly is 30 grams of carbs? What does that all mean? Well, 30 grams per hour means that we just want to try to get in about 30 grams of carbs for every hour of exercise that we're performing. And 30 grams of carbohydrates can actually be ingested in a few different ways. All right, so that's actually what Gatorade was meant for. So if we take kind of, the smaller size bottle of Gatorade, or the medium size, I should say, that has about 21 grams of rapidly ingestible carbs that we're going to get energy from right away. We can think about it in terms of whole foods. So that's things like a medium-sized banana or a small to medium-sized apple. Those also have anywhere from 20 to 30 grams of carbohydrates in them too. Or if we're somebody who sweats a lot and we need to have a lot of fluid, kind of more the lower sugar version of Gatorade, the G2, a larger bottle has about 20 grams as well. So we're getting pretty close to that about 30 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So you're probably thinking now, okay, well, carbs and fluids are so good. I need to keep my performance up. I know how much I have. I need to start doing this right away. Got to throw this into practice, throw this into games. Well, we don't want to do that so fast because just like our muscles, our stomach is an organ and it needs to be trained to work at its best, right? So if we're a player who is not used to drinking, a ton of fluid or having a lot of carbohydrates during games or, intermissions, practices, things like that, we need to work up to it, right? We need to gradually increase those amounts so that we don't have any kind of, sloshy stomach or, hurts our gut or anything like that, right? We don't want to try to jump right into things and then hurt our performance while we're trying to actually make it better. Those are the things that we need to make sure that we gradually work into and get our way there. So we kind of sum it up and we talk about what we've learned from the carbohydrate section. We've learned that carbs can improve aspects of hockey performance, like completing more tape-to-tape passes and keeping us sliding across the crease quickly. We learned that carbs before, during and after practices and games can help top off our fuel supply, make sure that we are fueled and ready and have our energy in tip-top shape for best results. And then we learned that it's important to personalize our carbohydrate habits. And what I mean by that is we need to think about training our stomachs and not jumping right into it and not looking at the guy sitting to our right or, the gal sitting to our left and say, hey, they're having this much amount. I need to do that right away. No, we need to figure out what's right for us and gradually work up to those volumes that we think is going to help our performance the most. All right, so one last slide here to kind of tie all of it together, put it all in simple terms. And essentially what we see is that, again, proper hydration can help us maximize our performance on the ice. We learn that sodium and carbohydrate or energy are important to digest, retain, and distribute the fluid. And an area that we didn't really touch much on today, but is important, just not if not more important, is our hydration away from the rink, right? Our hydration, not just during our practices, but during the day. Those same studies that we talked about earlier actually indicate that at least 50% of hockey players show up to the rink dehydrated, right? If we're already dehydrated, puts us even in an even bigger hole, and we're not even going to start off the practice where we could be. And it's all downhill from there, right? So we need to make sure that we're thinking about doing the proper things away from the rink as well. And then finally, we learned that everybody has different needs and preferences, and what works for your liney might not be something that works for you, and that's perfectly okay, right? We don't think Sidney Crosby and Brad Marchand are the same person, so everybody's got to do what's right for them. And that leads me to the end, so hopefully we have some questions, and be happy to answer any that came through.
Thanks, Anthony. That was excellent. Great information. So like Anthony said, we'll open it up to anybody that has questions. I could maybe start off with one, maybe to get us going. You didn't mention protein. Is that important for hockey players? Because you probably hear people having protein bars and things like that. So that's my question.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Scott. I appreciate that. It definitely is. Again, trying not to cram too much in. We kind of left that one out, but protein is just as important of a macronutrient as carbohydrates and fluid. Particularly for us as athletes, young athletes, we want to try to put on some muscle mass. Most of us maybe gain a little bit of weight. And generally speaking, for us as hockey players, what we're looking for on a day-to-day basis is to get about 1.2 to 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight. So if we use that same example that we kind of flowed through the whole way, a 75 kilo athlete or a guy that weighs about 165 pounds is looking to get in anywhere from about 90 grams of protein all the way up to about 165 grams of protein per day. Now, we don't want to get all that in one sitting. So I'm not saying, dump 4 scoops of protein in your shaker and drink that up. We want to spread that out throughout the day. Hopefully we can get that in anywhere, 20 to 30 gram bouts. So you can think of that as, a chicken breast or a protein shake or anything like that. You know, Anywhere between 3 to 5 to 6 of those a day is what we're looking for.
Great, thanks for that. If there's no other questions, I've got one more. Is there an easy way to monitor or check hydration levels throughout the day?
Yeah, that's another great one. So an easy way to monitor our hydration throughout the day is we can maybe take that from maybe the World Juniors, videos and stuff, and that's looking at urine. So obviously we're not going to take that away and analyze it ourselves or anything like that. Well, a real quick and easy way to do that is to just kind of look at the color, and it's going to fluctuate throughout the day. And sometimes if we just had a lot of water, our urine might not have caught quite up to us yet. But generally speaking, it's a really good way. And what we're looking for is we want our urine to be light like lemonade and not dark like apple juice. We don't want our water to be or our urine to be completely clear like water. That means we're probably drinking a little bit too much. We want to have a little bit of color. But if we stick to kind of that lemonade looking color, that usually means we're in the right stage.
Well, thank you for that. Is there any more questions of Anthony? I don't have any more, Anthony, sorry, but okay, seeing as there are no further questions, we'll conclude the virtual session for tonight. I want to thank Anthony again for taking the time, and thanks to those that attended tonight's presentation. Make sure you visit our website for all the presentations, the recordings, and as well as the PowerPoint decks. And stay tuned for our next live webinar next Tuesday, February 6th, where we'll be discussing mental performance with a Hockey Canada representative. So if you have any questions, my contact information is on the OHF website, so please feel free to contact me. And on behalf of the Ontario Hockey Federation, thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your evening.